Last 2,000 years of human history, no book has exercised such an influence on Western culture as has the Bible. In the last 3.5 centuries of that period of 2,000 years, no edition of that book has exercised such far-reaching influence on the self-same Western culture as has the King James Version of the Bible. Western culture in general, the English-speaking countries in particular, and the United States more particularly so. So we begin this morning no less than one of 30 messages on the King James Version of the Bible. In the United States, it's known as the KJV. In England, it's known as the AV. So we're generally going to refer to it as the KJV, since we're English-speaking Christians of the United States, not of England or Great Britain. AV stands for the Authorized Version. But anytime you read something about the KJV from a British perspective, it will never be the KJV. They never refer to it as the King James Bible. They always refer to it as the Authorized Version, the Authorized Bible. It's the most popular and most used of all English translations, and I don't know that the world's going to exist long enough for it to ever be replaced. Many people have said that horse is now dead, but it has always resurrected and taken by storm the English-speaking world again. Whenever the EV came out in the end of last century, they thought that would do it for the KJV because it was the first after 250 years revision of it. But it didn't. That version passed under the carpet and the KJV stayed alive. And they thought they would do it again with the ASV, and that didn't do anything. And of course, over the years up into the modern decades of our life and time, new versions have come along for a while sometimes to displace the KJV, but the KJV always seems to resurrect and revive. One of the professors down at Harding Graduate School of Religion in Memphis, Tennessee, has said, don't count the KJV out too early, because history has proven that it always will resurrect and revive. Well, of course, we'll see whether that's true, whether it can continue to hold its ground. But I don't know that the world is going to last long enough for any version to exercise the far-reaching influence upon English-speaking countries that the KJV has. Now, we plan on giving a very thorough look at all aspects of the KJV, and that's why it's the most important Bible for English-speaking people which has ever been written. I've gone through several KJV Bibles. When I say gone through, I mean I've worn them out, just literally worn them out. I mean, I don't know what, my third or fourth one now that I've had for 5 years, and I've taken a lot better care of it, and I haven't traveled around to so many different places. It's probably why it's in as good a condition as it is. Of course, I keep it bound in this little cover, but I kept the other ones bound too, and I wore them out anyway, just from turning the pages in it. So that's how much I have used the KJV. I would say it's somewhat of a specialty item of mine as far as study, and that's why you might not think how we can get 30 messages, and that's probably a minimum number, to talk about the KJV, but I think that we can. There's a whole lot to say about it. There are all types of odd things just concerning the printing of the KJV. So many different words and chapter divisions and the punctuation and meanings and English idiom and all types of things that I have just, been so familiar with over the years for having read the Bible so much, and I think that I do have a lot to say about it. So even if you are using your NIV, you want to be sure to bring your KJV at least on Sunday morning. You probably bring it anyway, but we are going to be using it and looking in a lot of detail. Some of you who are more newly saved maybe than I am, and maybe than some others, you might not be as familiar with it as the rest of us. But I am amazed every time I sit down to read it. We're reading it over again in our prayer time in my study, and I'm reading it over again privately at home, so there's 2 times that I'm reading it at the same time, plus some other versions, that I can hardly come to a verse that I don't know how it ends. And that's in, whether it's in Genesis or Malachi or Matthew. And that's just because I've read it so much. I guess if you've done anything that much, you just become very familiar with it. So I appreciate its language. I appreciate its poetry very much. It's a beautiful work. It's never been surpassed as far as beauty is concerned. Maybe as far as the reliability of the text is concerned, that would be another matter. But it's never been surpassed in my estimation, in my opinion, for its beauty, for its poetry, for its rhythmical quality. And that's why I continue to enjoy reading it today. What we're going to begin with in KJV studies concerns the politics of the era in which it was translated. The history and the politics of this era are so crucial, I think, for a proper understanding of the translation itself. It's referred to as the King James Version, but of course King James didn't do it. Maybe like some people would naively think that he actually did the work. He was king at the time that it was done. And so if you were like myself, I'd want to know a little bit of the history of what's going on in England now, and why do we have a need for a new Bible? And who is this man, King James, anyway? Everyone has used his name. His name has been on everyone's lips, but just who is this man, King James? And then maybe more importantly than the rest of that, who are the men that did the King James Version of the Bible? What type of people were they? What type of regulations and stipulations did they have upon them? What were the committees like and the meetings like? What were their criteria in deciding one text versus another and translating something in one way versus another? What are their biases? All people have biases. All people have pre-understandings when they come to anything, unless you're maybe an infant. We all have pre-understandings. And our pre-understandings affect our understanding of the topic at hand or under consideration. There are good pre-understandings, there are bad pre-understandings. There are good biases, there are bad biases. What type of biases do they have? You see, all Protestant churches, whether they're Assembly of God or Lutheran, have used the King James Version of the Bible. So it's not just a sectarian work that was for a certain group of people or used only by a certain group of people, but it's been used by Protestants in general, English-speaking Protestants in general, for 350 plus years. So if you'll open your King James Bible, we want to turn to the epistle dedicatory, as it's referred to, something that you probably never have read in your King James Bible. You jumped into Genesis after you had the table of contents memorized. But it actually starts with this. And the original King James Bible actually had a preface entitled The Translators to the Reader, which regretfully, I might say, is not included in modern editions or printings of the King James Bible. I do have it in others, but it's not printed in moderns, and that's sad. I regret that, because it's very worthy and worthwhile to include it, maybe more so than the epistle dedicatory. You'll find this right after the marriage and births and deaths and things like that. We're not going to study marriages and births and deaths, the family history of your family. I don't have any even in mind. Matrimony, you got all types of certificates. All I have is Chino D. Ross, received June the 14th, 1982 by some unknown giver. Of course, who that unknown giver is not unknown to at least one of you. And maybe more, but I never was blessed to find out who gave it to me. But I bet you're going to get some rubies in your crown in heaven, because think how many messages have been preached out of this. Cost you 20 or 25 of your dollars or whatever. I'm sure that's why they did it, so they could sit back and smile every time I preach. But that's my Bible that I gave him up there. To the most high and mighty Prince James, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, the translators of the Bible, with grace, mercy, and peace through Jesus Christ our Lord. And this was actually written by the men who translated the Bible. More specifically, Miles Smith, and Thomas Bilson, who had a lot to do with the additional work that was added, the final addition and revision. as well as the preface, the translators to the reader, done primarily by Miles Smith. Now, you watch this and you'll see a little history in England and see if you don't know a little bit of what they're already talking about. But here's where we're going to have to begin. And we're going to study this. We only have a few paragraphs, paragraph by paragraph, and it's going to take us a few weeks. Whenever we need to, we'll come back to it and pick up where we left off and go on. So we're just going to do the first paragraph this morning to introduce ourselves to this man. Great and manifold were the blessings, most dread sovereign, which Almighty God, the Father of all mercies, bestowed upon us, the people of England, when first he sent your Majesty's royal person to rule and to reign over us. See, whenever I was, first saved and baptized in the Holy Spirit, and the Bible that I was using was the KJV, and so I continued to use it after that. And I guess after I finished reading the Bible, I was looking for something else to read. So I went to the back of the Bible and found some notes by Samuel Schultz, a teacher at Wheaton College, and went to the front of the Bible and found this epistle dedicatory and got into this and began reading this and studying this and trying to put, everything together. Now, what's going on here? So I was familiar with this from back in those days and reading it. And you're probably not familiar with even the train of thought where we're headed in this epistle dedicatory, but you need to be, so you know something about the origin of the KJV. For whereas it was the expectation of many who wished not well unto our Zion, that upon the setting of that bright occidental star, Queen Elizabeth, of most happy memory, just recently dead at this time. This is what they were expecting, many people, to happen after her death. Some thick and palpable clouds of darkness would have so overshadowed this land that men should have been in doubt which way they were to walk, and that it should hardly be known who was to direct the unsettled state. The appearance of your Majesty as of the sun in his strength instantly dispelled those supposed and surmised mists, and gave unto all that were well affected exceeding cause of comfort, especially when we beheld the government established in your highness and your hopeful seed by an undoubted title, and this also accompanied with peace and tranquility at home and abroad. Notice the poetry and the flowing, flowery language just of that, and it gets better by the time we get to that little bottom concluding paragraph, as you see if you just turn the page. So this morning, the title of the message is James, Sixt and First. S-I-X-T. We didn't leave off a letter, that's just the way you see it anciently, so I decided to leave it the same. James, Sixt and First. Just who is this man, King James? Well, he was the only son of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, and her cousin, Henry Stuart, who later became Lord Darnley, D-A-R-N-L-E-Y. Now, this Mary is not to be confused with the other Mary, Mary Tudor, that we have discussed earlier, who was a Queen of England. Mary Stuart was a Queen of Scotland. So two Marys are somewhat related. Most of the nobility is during this day, even if we're talking about different countries, but yet two entirely different people of the same religious persuasion, but still two entirely different people. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, is not to be confused with Mary Tudor, Queen of England, who also is known as Bloody Mary. Let's look at some of the history and some of the pedigree of these people. Mary Tudor, Mary Stuart, their families did come to intertwine. We have James coming in as a result, and we'll see what James' relation is to all of these other people. Notice in the beginning of this epistle dedicatory, or the epistle of dedication to King James, he's referred to as King of Great Britain, King of France, King of Ireland, and Defender of the Faith. So let's start with Mary Tudor. We'll look at some of her family. Now I'll have here on the board for you in one easy to follow
scheme, hopefully, just what the relations of these people is. So we're going to go back with Mary Tudor. She's a queen in England, but we have to go back to get the history of the kings and queens and nobility on the English throne during the 16th century, during the 1500s. So, of course, we would go all the way back to Henry. Henry VIII was the first important leader of England that we discussed before, and it's through him that all of these important people are going to come, through the different wives, the 6 or 7 wives that he had. Now, Henry rules from 1509 to 1547. He has a son, Edward VI, who rules 1547, 1553. Edward has a full sister, whose name is Mary Tudor, who rules 1553, to 1558. I say full sister because they had the same mother, Catherine of Aragon. And after Mary Tudor comes Elizabeth I, who rules the longest of them all, from 1558 to 1603. She's a half-sister of Mary Tudor, the half-sister of Edward VI, full daughter of Henry VIII, but of course by another wife of his. And this is by Queen Anne Boleyn. So they have different mothers, but they're still related. Edward VI and Mary Tudor by Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I by Henry VIII and Queen Anne Boleyn. And then we finally come to James. If he's on the English throne, then he's known as James I. If he's on the Scottish throne, he's known as James VI. Hence the title James Sixt and First. Now the English descent of the kings and the queens will look something like that. That takes us for 100 years now, or over 100 years, but about 100 years, all through the 16th century, up into the early part, the first quarter, exactly the first quarter, 25 years of the 17th century. Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, Edward VI, 1547 to 1553, Mary Tudor, 1553 to 58, Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, and James I, 1603 to 1625. Now, let me get some of this out of the way and we'll go over here to Mary Stuart. Let's leave at least that much. Now, because we're talking about English translations, although the Scottish people speak the English language, we're not too concerned about who the Scottish kings and queens are. Anyway, within 100 years of this time, by the first decade of the 18th century, early 1700s, these nations are all joined together, and they become referred to as the United Kingdom, as they really still are down to this day. So let's just give you briefly some background of Mary Stuart. She lived from 1542 to 1587. This is the mother of James. Notice how all of these people, from Henry, let's say, down to Elizabeth, you can obviously see their relation. And then here, we break in with this man, James. Now, he's not a descendant of Elizabeth or Mary or Edward or Henry. He's a descendant way over here from Mary Stuart. So how does he get over here in England then? See, it becomes rather confusing how James ends up over here in England, and he's really not English, and now we have this Bible named after him, the greatest of all English translations, the King James Bible, by a man who was Scottish by birth, not English. Well, that's what we're looking at here. Mary Stuart was the only child of James V, who died shortly after she was born, James V, that is. She was the only child of James V. But James V was a Scottish king. I'm just assuming you're going to remember that we're talking about England over here, and we're talking about Scotland over here. She became queen in 1543, when she was 6 days old. She had to because her father died. She was next in line. She's an only child. So if you have a son, then he becomes king, because he's next in line. If you don't have a son, then you don't have a king anymore. For a while anyway, you have a queen. Hopefully she marries, produces a son, and we're back to kingship in the land. So she becomes queen of Scotland in 1543, 6 days of age. So she's born late in 1542, as you can see. She goes through several marriages. She marries when she's like 16 or 17 well, he's called a half-wit young man. I think he was probably mentally retarded, and he died after a couple of years. And so she's no longer married to him. She eventually marries her cousin, Henry Stuart. Her cousin, Henry Stuart. Now, the marriage was approved by the Pope. It really had to be, because Mary Stuart was a devout Roman Catholic, just like the other similar soul, Mary Tudor, who was a devout Roman Catholic on the English throne. We have problems in the Scottish court that erupt immediately because she was French trained. She was raised in the French court. And because she was raised in the French court and she's French trained, and she has many French advisors around her, she is pro-Roman Catholic doctrine. But she has many people in her parliament who are English trained and are thus pro-Protestantism. You see, France was a Roman Catholic country, as you probably know by now, and England was a Protestant country. So for her to be trained in France and most of the members of her parliament to be trained in England, we're going to have problems erupt between her and Parliament. Parliament gets the upper hand, and in 1560, the Scottish Parliament abolishes the authority of the Pope in Scotland. And so since that time, Scotland has been a Protestant country. In 1560, Parliament abolishes the authority of the Pope in Scotland. It forbids the Mass, and it adopts, at that time, a Reformed confession. And your confession is like your religious bylaws. So we have the 1560 Scottish Confession, which is a Reformed confession, versus a Roman Catholic one. She even sparred a little with John Knox over the subject of transubstantiation in the Mass. She, of course, Mary Stuart, being in favor of it, and John Knox being disinclined to that. And Knox, of course, is a great Scottish church leader, the founder of Presbyterianism. Now, after this very tragic series of events that takes place in her life, let me see if I can just, let me read it to you from another person's writing, and then I'll try to sum all of this up to you. Mary Stuart was a very unhappy, as some people have said, very unlucky lady. She was similar to Mary Tudor on the English throne in that they're both Roman Catholic. They both have a relatively short period of reigning on the throne in their respective countries. They both have lots of turmoil and lots of problems during their reign. She starts off very young in life. Mary Tudor, someone else, was really on the throne, I think, for a month or two before Mary Tudor was put on the throne. And Mary Tudor's reign for the first couple of years, from 1553 to 54, was relatively quiet and peaceful. And things started erupting in the next year in 55, and we have the reign of Bloody Mary. But anyway, let's start about here. In July of 1565, with the approval of the Pope, she married her cousin, Henry Stuart. Lord Darnley. Really, later he becomes Lord Darnley. He's not at this time. But she's already been married back when she was 16 to a 14-year-old boy. Meanwhile, David Riccio, an Italian valet de chambre, just a member of the Scottish court, had been advanced with very noticeable rapidity to the position of secretary and personal advisor to Mary Stuart. Now this is going to become important. R-I-C-C-I-O, David Riccio. He's an Italian by birth, but he is a member of the Scottish court. A valet de chambre was a male member's male servant. So he has been advanced to be a female member's, the Queen's male servant. And so it doesn't look very good. In other words, we have just like during some of the reigns of the English kings and queens, we have all types of intrigue and suspicion and marital infidelity and questions of marital fidelity taking place. Remember Henry VIII, so we've got the same problems with marriage back in England that we do have over here in Scotland. One evening in March of 1566, when she, Mary Stuart, being 6 months pregnant, was sitting at supper in a room in the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh with Riccio and one of the court ladies. On this night, a band of armed men burst in upon them and demanded that Riccio accompany them to an adjoining bedroom. Riccio, screaming hysterically and clutching Mary's skirt, was dragged off. It is said that 50 dagger wounds were later found on his dead body. Lord Darnley, mad with jealousy, had instigated the murder with the willing aid of nobles whom Mary had alienated, probably Protestant ones. In February of the following year, 1567, Lord Darnley was murdered by the Earl of Bothwell. And a few weeks after that murder, Mary married the murderer of Lord Darnley, and when a few weeks later still, she was seized and taken prisoner by some of her nobles, and the angry bystanders roared after her in the streets of Edinburgh, "Burn the whore." The child that Mary carried in her womb that evening, when supper with Riccio had been stormily interrupted, her only child by her second marriage, was none other than the most high and mighty prince who later became King James. Now, what a type birth to have. The experts tell us that what happens to the mother during those months of pregnancy can affect the baby itself, whether she's happy or gloomy. And whenever you're going through different marriages and people are being murdered around you, then it can have an effect on the child. Whether that was the source of the problems in the mind and life of James, or whether they should be traced to something else, maybe is a matter to be disputed. But be that as it may, James I did have his own problems. So here's what happens. Her husband becomes jealous of her private male secretary and murders him. Then another man has her husband murdered. And then a few months later, Mary marries the man who murdered her husband, which to say the least caused great problems for her in her life. So she's married, and then she has a second marriage, and then her husband of the second marriage becomes jealous of Riccio, the Italian member of the Scottish court. He, with others, has him murdered because of jealousy, and then someone else later murders Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart, her cousin, her second husband. Then she, a few months after that, marries the man who murdered her husband, which makes that her third marriage. Now, of course, I guess you can see all of them, quote, scriptural, unquote. We don't have divorce and remarriage. We have the first husband kind of being a dimwit, and he dies when he's 16 after she's been married to him for 2 years. She marries him when she's 16 and he's 14. Then she marries a second man, and he's jealous over her new male court advisor and has, with others, him murdered, and then turns around and he's murdered by someone else, and then she marries the man that murdered him. And the whole time that this series of events is taking place, James is living in her tummy. In 1567, she was forced to abdicate and her new little boy James was crowned king. Only child that she has now by her second marriage. She doesn't have any by the first. So the first son born is the first one in the legitimate line for the Scottish kingship. And James is her first one born in the second marriage. We don't even need to be concerned about the third marriage, only the second one, because here we have the first birth taking place. 1567, she's forced to abdicate, and her son James, just as a boy, was crowned king. But Mary Stuart ends up in prison in England under her cousin, a distant cousin, Elizabeth I. So we're back here to this woman, Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth is a staunch Protestant, remember. Mary Stuart, a staunch Roman Catholic. So England being the bigger, the more ancient, the more important of the two countries, Elizabeth has some type of influence over Scotland, and particularly when things are going so badly for Mary Stuart and for the Scottish people. And so when she's forced to abdicate and James is put on the throne, then Elizabeth, who doesn't like this cousin of hers anyway, has her cousin, Mary Stuart, put in prison over in England. Now, the pro-Roman Catholic parties in England, they have been laying low, but they've been there all along. The pro-Roman Catholic parties in England made plans to secretly free her, release her from prison. But before they could carry out their plans, Elizabeth had Mary Stuart executed on February the 8th, 1587. February the 8th, 1587. Now, that's sad for Mary Stuart. But what's important about Mary Stuart is not herself, but the son that she gave birth to, James the Sixth. So with Mary Stuart behind us, let's go into the early life of James. James was born in the castle in Edinburgh, Scotland, in the year 1566. So he becomes king at the age of, let's say, 1, just like his mother had become queen at the age of 1, or 6 days. So that's interesting. Both James and his mother, Mary Stuart, take over the Scottish throne when they're just a baby at the age of 1. He was placed under a series of educational tutors. And the first of these, and perhaps the most important one during this period, was George Buchanan. George Buchanan. Now, I read you this little bit from McGregor's book here about the birth, although I could have told you the story about the pregnancy of Mary Stuart and later the birth of James. So you remember that these things are taking place while he's in his mother's womb. And whenever he's born, James is a very sickly child. His mother's first husband had been a very sickly boy. James himself is a very sickly child. Of course, back in those days, being a very sickly child was not something that was unusual. Women had 10 children in hopes that 3 would survive infancy. That was the literal truth back then. You just don't have 10 children. You have 10 children, but most of them die because of things like pneumonia. Think living in an Edinburgh castle. How are you going to stay warm in a place like that? There's fires in every room, but fires in a room that's 100 feet by 100 by 100, 100-foot cube. How are you going to stay warm in a place like that? Well, so many people died of colds and pneumonias and things like that. So he certainly went through his share of these trials whenever he was young. But although he was sickly, he received a very good education, as most of the children of nobility did. A first-rate training in the classics and in theology was the lot for James as he was growing up. Now, he studied in other areas, in literature and mathematics, but he had a first-rate upbringing in the classics and in theology. Although he becomes king of Scotland as a 1-year-old boy in 1566, it's not until 1578 that he actually begins ruling Scotland, at least nominally, by himself. It's not until 1578, whenever he's 12, that he even has the intellectual ability to begin to
suggests some things as far as the government is concerned. Still, of course, he works through tutors and people that are appointed over him. But at least nominally, he begins to rule Scotland alone in the year 1578. But since all of this has to do with Scottish history so far, then how in the world does he tie in with English history? Well, let's come to that next then, because it's his English history that we're most concerned about. Through a complicated set of relationships that I don't want to get into. I get tired of going through all of these relationships because you don't remember it anyway. And I had to do that whole long list up for the Herodian family in intertestamental period class, and it'd be about a list like that we'd have to do here. So let's just sum it up by saying through a complicated set of relationships. James was actually related to Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII, through his mother, Mary Stuart. And of course, Henry VII had been King of England long, long ago. So that is the tie-in relationship between the English and the Scottish throne. James, through his mother, Mary Stuart, in a very distant way, was related to an early English king, Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII. His mother was a cousin of sorts, I don't know how far removed, but was a cousin of the present English Queen Elizabeth. So when Elizabeth dies, March the 24th, 1603, she has no children to follow her on the throne. So who do you think the closest heir to the English throne is then? Her cousin, a distant cousin's son, James VI of Scotland, who happens through his mother to be related to English nobility way back over 100 years earlier, and Henry VII. So that is how he figures into English history. If Elizabeth would have had a son, James would never have come to England. And the Bible would be the King Edward version instead of the King James version, because we don't have English kings by the name James. So Elizabeth dies on March 24th in 1603, and the closest heir to the English throne is none other than the Scottish king who has been king for 37 years in Scotland. He's no boy anymore now. He has been king for 37 years because he's a 37-year-old man. That is James VI of England. That was the name of Scottish kings. James, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. James I of England. James VI of Scotland, James I of England, because this is the first time we have an English king by the name James. So then, in the year 1603, just by law almost, at least by the law of the nobles, James VI of Scotland has to become the new king of England, and he comes as James I. He rules in England as well as over Scotland at the same time now, because the kingdoms are somewhat united, from 1603 to 1625. So he's king 50 or 60 years over Scotland, you see, but just 22 years over England. Now, do you understand that thus far? He's got two names, James VI and James I. It's the same man, though. James VI when you're talking about Scotland, James I whenever you're talking about England. We'll have other James that come later, but that's why we're listing James I here, because we have him in the English family. He's over here under Mary Stuart, and he's James VI. He becomes king just as a boy. Whenever he comes to the English throne, the English people at first, this is very flowery language here, but that's just the way people wrote in those days. Sometimes they hadn't studied people's papers called The Anatomy of a Lie, and so they used flowery language, but they didn't really mean that. The people weren't that happy with James whenever he first came. As a matter of fact, they were very displeased, but they're displeased with most kings and queens. Elizabeth had been somewhat of a good queen, but this flowery language upon the setting of that bright occidental star, Queen Elizabeth, the most happy memory, I'm sure that's stretching it quite a bit.
Because the people of antiquity just didn't look upon their leaders, their kings and queens, as being great people because of heavy taxation, because they lived in rich castles in London and Edinburgh, and so many of the poor people had to do without. But you can't put that in the preface to a Bible, this wicked queen of ours, and now we got this nasty King James. There'd be no business in dedicating the Bible to him if you're going to use language like that. So it was kind of the end thing to do. It was custom to dedicate the Bible to an important figure such as the king or queen and use great flowery language. Now whenever James comes to the throne, he wants to unite the kingdoms of England and Scotland and Ireland. They're all kind of three countries that are the same. And in an informal sense, I guess we could say they are united. Because he's king of Scotland, and that makes him kind of king of Ireland, and he becomes king of England. But the formal union of these countries, England, Scotland, and Ireland, doesn't take place until the year 1707. And they then become known as the United Kingdom. You've heard of that before, the United Kingdom? Well, that began in 1707. Now, let's take a pause here as I try to wrap some things up, and let me just kind of tell you where we're going to go through all of this, and some of those interesting things that we are going to look at in the King James Bible. You're going to find that a lot of these things have already come out. Corrections of paragraph divisions, corrections of spelling, the modernization of outdated, antiquated terms that are found in the King James Bible, poor textual consideration, poor textual selections that are made by the King James translators, and on and on and on and on. Some of this has already come out. Some of that's going to be duplicated, but I hope that we can be so precise and so thorough and so join all of these things together that you'll know that this all fits under, very properly, a study of the King James translation of the Bible. For instance, to give you one example of what I'm talking about, we've always told you to mark out things like candlestick and various words like that, and Jehovah and things like that, and put in something that's more correct. Now we're going to be more systematic as we go throughout this study, and looking at terms like that, and whys and the wherefores and the origins, and all of the strange words that are found, like what and listeth, and these things that are found in the King James Bible, where they're found, what they mean, why they were used, and when and where they need to be updated. Of course, when you start tampering with the Bible, the King James Version, in updating it, then almost you're opting in favor of some of the modern versions that are around, whose one purpose, among others, is to do that very thing, update some of the antiquated language that's found in the King James Bible. For instance, what was that verse we were looking at the other night? Oh, Acts 15:21. The one we were looking at Friday night. If you look at this and see how it's said in the King James, I don't know what you were reading the other night, and this is just very poor sentence order. You'll have it, I think the whole sentence will be just about swapped around backwards in the NIV. Because we're given a lot of introductory information, but we don't really have a verb where we're told what's going on here in this verse. Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him. Now we finally know what we're talking about. Someone's doing some type of preaching. It'd be better to somehow swap the word order around, the sentence order around here, so it makes better sense. It reads better English for us today. Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. But although we can improve on the English grammar of that today, so that it is more English, that is, we can read it better, whenever you improve on it like that, then it becomes less easy to memorize. And that's one thing about the King James Bible. The way the words are used here make it extremely, extremely easy to memorize. Now, poets know this. People who are trained in this, I'm not trained in that, but I know enough from reading it. I know what Bibles, when I read, I can memorize it, and what are just so much out of this world, there's no way you could ever really sit down and memorize verses from a Bible like that, because maybe it reads too well, and it just doesn't have enough of the flow. The people who are professionals and who are trained, they can look at this and see, what a beautiful sentence here. Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. And let me show you another one. We'll go over so many of these. You won't believe the hundreds of verses. It may go over the hundreds. It may be into thousands by the time we're through. But Hebrews 4 and 13. Hebrews 4 and 13. Watch Hebrew in the Old Testament has rhythm. It doesn't have rhyme, but it does have rhythm. All poetry has to have rhythm. It may not have rhyme like we think of Jack and Jill went up the hill, but it's going to have some type of rhythm to it. Watch the rhythm of this verse, especially the second half. Hebrews 4:13. Neither is there... Now, we wouldn't generally start off a sentence like that. We would say that there is not something. But neither is there any creature that is not manifest in his sight. But all things are naked and open unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do. Notice how perfect that is? A two beat there, just dot, 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 all the way to the end of it. But all things are naked and open unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do. Now, a lot of people, you see, you read that, you didn't know, I didn't know it read like that. That's why things in the King James Bible seem to stick with you. All things are naked and open unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do. It just fits in there perfectly. And you don't know what's going on subconsciously in your mind, but your mind is telling you, hey, I can remember things like that. I can't remember when you rearrange the whole order and take all the rhythm out of it. I can remember things like that. And that's why more verses than not I memorized in the KJV without trying to. I just read them. And when you read it often enough, it just sounded so good, and it was just music to your ears. And that's why it stood out. And you'll just find hundreds of verses like this. You can't improve on Psalm 23. You can't improve on Psalm 91. You can't improve on Psalm 121, although versions try to. You really can't improve on that when you're trying to give the Word of God to people if you have any meaning of those people remembering what they're reading there. You just can't improve on that. We could jump through this, we'll look over in chapter 12, how easy these first verses in chapter 12 are. Wherefore, seeing we are compassed about. Now, we don't talk like that. Wherefore, brother, I was compassed about with trials yesterday. We would not say that, but if you would, it would remember it longer. Wherefore, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Think of Hebrews 11, this by faith through faith chapter. How much of that is so easy to memorize. And, well, we don't want to go too far ahead of ourselves because we'll look at this later. But you can just go from old through new, from Genesis to Revelation. And you're talking about a very, very beautiful work. That's why I think it is more worthy than any other translation or version of the allotted time I have to study it. We won't be doing this with all the other modern translations. I don't think I could think of 30 messages worth of things to say on them. Except this Bible stinks as far as its reading ability is concerned. And you could say that in one. But the King James, it has so many interesting twists to it. It is just a fascinating work. It is like a little treasure chest, to me anyway. It's a treasure chest of all nooks and crannies in it, with little things hidden that you'll never, I can just think of all these verses, strange ways that things are said, that I hope over the next 30 or 40 messages we'll be able to show to you. So that's one thing we're going to concentrate a lot of our time on. But before we get to that, we're going to look at what brought about the origin of the King James Bible. Now we know something about the man, not enough. We want to know some more about him, and we'll learn that next time we study this. We'll look at who this most high and mighty prince is. We've seen the origin of Sixt first now, how he became king of both countries. But most high and mighty prince, that's quite a designation or title for a man. So can we prove the worth of that title? We'll look some at the origin of how it was brought about, which concerns the whole history in the English church of the Anglicans versus the Puritans. The Anglicans by far, the Church of England that is, outnumbered the Puritan people. And old scholars like John Reynolds, but people like John Reynolds happen to be the most important people as far as the actual work that was done and the impetus and the origin for the work. And Reynolds comes from a Puritan background and not an Anglican or Church of England background. And And then what may be a little meticulous and a little tedious, in other words boring for some of you, is looking at all of the men, 54 or 57 men, man by man, name by name, who had some hand in this work. Some of the men we know a lot of information about, like John Reynolds, like Sir Lancelot Andrews, Thomas Bilson, one of the final editors, a little bit, Miles Smith, a whole lot, and just down the line. Many of them we know only a little about. So I can tell you what degree they held, from which school it was taken. We'll discuss some of the marriages. We have so many humorous things about these men. Who was married and who wasn't? Who was Puritan, who wasn't? Who lived locally and who had to travel to get there? You know, where the work was done, how long it took them, who took what parts of the Bible, what were they paid, what type of entertainment, what type of refreshments were they served. We know about all of this because we have English records and history about all of these matters. And Shakespeare will come into play with this, and some of the Shakespearean players were some of the entertainers for the men whenever they first met at the Hampton Court Conference, one of those old castles there. And then we go on beyond that to look at the series of 15 guidelines that were given for the translation, drawn up by James, or approved by James, and drawn up by some of the other scholars. There were three different places where they met, and two different groups at each of those three places, giving us 6 groups of men who did the work then. Not counting questions of final groups and not counting questions of final editors or revisers such as Smith and Thomas Bilson. And then we'll take paragraph by paragraph the very interesting preface entitled The Translators to the Reader, done chiefly by Miles Smith, which is just very interesting. We'll look at the early printings of the work, which will include many of the early misprints in the work, and we'll give you a long list of nicknames that you can attach to those earlier 4 or 5 or 6, I believe, that I've given you. And then we'll probably round it out with some studies of the glory of the KJV and things concerning its future revision. How it was received in England, how it was not received by some people, and how over the long haul, as they say, it proved to be indomitable.